Good morning, Oslo. Greetings from the European Parliament. I want to thank the organizers for having invited me to this very interesting and even more topical conference. I would have wanted to be present, but my duties in the Parliament keep me today in Brussels. First, about today's topic, the end of Nordic exceptionalism. I want to say that as the Finnish Minister for International Development between 2011 and 2013, I experienced in practice the good cooperation between Nordic development ministers. Together, we acted as a team, be it in a European, UN or in other international conferences and meetings. I could always trust my Nordic colleagues in advancing human rights, gender issues and, for example, transparency. The amount of our development budgets had effect, and we were listened to very much differently than to each of us alone. Therefore, I fully see that the Nordic exceptionalism exists. It is also important not to lose it. Our primary aim is to eradicate poverty and answer other global challenges, and not to promote our self-interested goals. However, sustainable development also helps our societies. We are committed to applying the international norms of development policy, including aid effectiveness. It would be time to follow these, let's say, neutral and idealist guidelines more than ever. If and when we want to globally implement the new Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, we need our resources and our will for transformative change. And this is no business as usual. It requires big changes in all policies, from foreign policy to trade and tax policy. At the same time, I am seeing an erosion of the Nordic exceptionalism. In 2015, the Nordics used less money to development aid. Finland is cutting almost half of its aid budget for 2016, Denmark 1/6. Norway and Sweden are using more money, but 1/5 of that is directed to refugees. That does not really contribute to the situation in developing countries. Still, Norway, Denmark and Sweden are respecting the 0.7% of GNI or even 1% target. The one that is clearly departing from the Nordic family is, and I'm sad to say this, is Finland. It was already difficult for me to defend development aid budget in the previous government due to economic constraints. But we still achieved 0.6% in 2014, and we used revenues from the emission trading system in an innovative way to development and international climate financing. Unfortunately, now the new government is making a U-turn. Cutting Finland's development aid by 330 million euros is outrageous. It means some 40% less support for the world's poorest. In reality, the cut is even more significant, 70 to 100 million more, as the revenues from the emission trading system are no longer directed to development. The Finnish support to fighting poverty and climate change collapses from 0.6% to 0.35% during the year, when donors should have already reached the famous 0.7 target. The implementation of the new Sustainable Development Goals requires more funding, not less. Until now, Finland has prioritized aid to the poorest and most fragile countries. We have funded education of girls and provided potable water for 3 million people in Ethiopia. The long-term work in protecting human rights, reducing inequality and fighting climate change is now severely jeopardized. The whole Finnish development sector is amputated, and that has created an internal conflict. While 42% of the funding of development civil society organizations is being cut, the annual funding for concessional loans for businesses operating in developing countries grows 13 times. I heard Norway is also cutting its aid to civil society organizations. Also, other Nordic countries support more private sector. This is as well a trend at the international level, as we saw in Addis Ababa in the Financing for Development conference. There is a need to increase support for private sector in developing countries, but this should not be done at the expense of other aid. At least the Finnish support for private sector seems to be done from self-interested reasons. Why cannot the support be channeled to private sector in developing countries instead of the private sector in Finland? The Finnish government is preparing a new development policy where the democratic ownership of developing countries seems to be forgotten. Aid is justified only from the perspective of what Finland gains from it, to put it bluntly. This kind of thinking shows also on the international level. The EU and Norway were the only ones making concrete pledges for reaching the new sustainable goals. In the EU, there is an increasing willingness to use development aid for migration policy. According to the EU Accountability Report on Financing for Development, which we just discussed in the Development Committee of the Parliament yesterday, the Union has failed to meet the targets to focus aid to Africa and least developed countries. We, the Nordics, are now needed more than before. I very much hope that you have a fruitful discussion and find ways to build the Nordic exceptionalism once again. Thank you, and I wish you a great conference.